Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm going to be doing a charcoal drawing of an American buffalo. I'm going to use some charcoal pencils and vine charcoal. I want to do this one like a vignette. What that means is that I won't draw all of the background, but I will fade my drawing towards the edges, including only some portions of the background. The paper I'm working on is Fabriano sketching paper. It's a little bit thinner than what I normally use, but it has a very nice tooth for working with charcoal, I think. So I started with a little bit of charcoal powder, which I created by sharpening one of my vine charcoal sticks. And I started tentatively drawing some shapes of the clouds, or rather drawing around the shapes of the clouds, because the clouds will be of lighter value than that bit of the background there. After that I started working a little bit more with a piece of vine charcoal. Vine charcoal is natural charcoal that comes in sticks like these, and it can be easily blended and moved around because it doesn't really stick to the paper. So don't worry about these lines, I will soften them and blend them a little bit later. Now the idea here is to create some suggestions of clouds in the background. My reference is going to be in the description, but you will see that I made some changes to the composition and that I made some changes to the shapes of the clouds. I wanted the clouds to be arranged in such a way so that my main subject stands out a little bit better, I suppose. I did a little bit of blending with a piece of paper towel, but I realized that I'm going to need a bit more value, especially around the edges of those clouds. So I decided to put in a bit more of the willow charcoal or vine charcoal. And then I did some more blending with a brush. So here I'm pushing in a little bit harder because I realized that I need a bit more value. I need a bit more contrast between the clouds themselves and that light background, and you can see how I'm fading that background towards the edges. That's what the vignette is supposed to look like. Now I'm refining the edges of the clouds by working with a pencil eraser. It's a Koh-i-Noor eraser in a pencil that can be sharpened pretty much like a pencil, and it allows for a little bit more precision, and it's more convenient because you can hold it and use it like a pencil. As for the pencils I'm using Koh-i-Noor charcoal pencils. So I created some irregular shapes of some distant clouds kind of towering over the prairie, and I'm going to add a little bit of grass under the buffalo, and I'll get to that a bit later. Right now I'm just playing around with the shape of those clouds, maybe trying to make them look a bit more complex, adding a few details here and there. So now we're going to get to the main subject, and I'm going to work with a charcoal pencil now for the most part. I'm going to throw in a little bit of vine charcoal here and there, but mostly with this charcoal pencil. So these Koh-i-Noor charcoal pencils, they come in different grades, I suppose. I'm using a medium one or something, I'm not really sure. Now I started with the back side and the legs here. These are mostly going to be darker because they're facing down and away from the light source. The top part will be considerably lighter because it's facing towards the light source. The light is coming from above naturally. Now as you can see, I'm blending with a brush. I mostly like to use flat brushes, and the advantage of these brushes is because when I blend I can just point that flat tip of the brush towards the edge, and that allows me to preserve a clean edge while blending. Clean edges are very important if you want to show where one surface or one object ends and the other one begins, which is why I which is why I'm using these brushes in such a way. And sometimes when a brush won't do for some of the tiniest details, I can also switch to a tortillon. Tortillons blend a little bit differently. I always like to use a combination of different blending tools because they all have slightly different effects. I made separate videos on that, but I'm not really going to get into that much now. But I think that with tortillons, especially when you're blending darker areas, you can retain that darker value, whereas with the brushes sometimes the charcoal dust just gets pushed around and it gets a little bit lighter in the process. So I'm working on this longer hair here on the front legs, and you can see how I'm making my brush strokes in such a way to imitate the appearance of longer fur. So when you're studying your reference photos, when you're studying the subjects of your drawing, you need to pay attention, if you're drawing furry animals, you need to pay attention to the length of the fur and the direction of the fur, and you need to try to match that length and direction with the length and direction of your strokes. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to take into account the fact that in some parts of the body, the fur, the hair will simply be longer, and in others it will be very short. So if you look at the back side and the thigh area on the hind legs, that's covered with very short fur. These front legs here, especially the top part and the whole area around the neck and the chest area, is covered with some very long and fluffy fur. So depending on the type of fur that I'm drawing, I'm going to adopt a different approach. So for example, here around the belly area, I can see that more of that body is covered with that shorter fur, and that's why I just covered it with some vine charcoal, and I'm just going to blend it. Now as I make a transition towards the longer fur around the shoulder and chest area, I'm going to be making more deliberate strokes with a pencil, trying to imitate the appearance of longer fur. Here on the belly area and on the sides of the belly, I can just blend with a brush, and I don't really have to worry about the texture too much because the texture mostly looks smooth because the hair, the fur, is shorter. So I'm blending that with a brush, and I actually like to use a combination of a couple of different brushes. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but let me just explain what I'm doing here at the top of the back here. And I'm using vine charcoal again because I want to create these slightly longer, softer marks. And I will be able to blend these easily, but I'm going to use a slightly different brush this time. I'm using a stiff bristle brush. So I either use softer synthetic brushes or these harder bristle brushes. They blend a little bit differently. The bristle brushes tend to push the charcoal in a little bit harder because they're harder themselves. So they allow you to retain a little bit more of the texture, whereas the softer brushes just move the material over the surface of the paper a little bit more smoothly, and they blend a bit more smoothly, creating less texture in the process. So as you can see here, I am making that transition towards that part of the body, the front part of the body, which has longer fur, and now you can see that I'm making pencil strokes to imitate the appearance of that fur. I also need a little bit more value, a little bit of shadow between the horns and the ears and the rest of the fur so that these lighter details would stand out. And I also need a little bit more value, a little bit more shadow between the head and the rest of the body, or that neck area, so that the head would stand out as a separate part of the body. But you can see that I actually need to make quite a few of these tiny marks. I need to make quite a few of these tiny marks to imitate the appearance of the fur. Sometimes, depending on the size and the complexity of the drawing, you have to make hundreds, if not thousands of them. There are other ways to imitate the texture of the fur, but sometimes you just have to do it this way. And when you blend that with a brush, not all of those marks will disappear. They will get softened a little bit, but as you can see, they are still there, which is why using brushes as blending tools is very important, because brushes, they soften the texture, they move the charcoal dust a little bit, they fill in some of those white spaces, white portions of the paper, but at the same time, even though they reduce the contrast a little bit, they allow you to retain that texture that you've put in a lot of work trying to create. And then you can work with that. You can go back in and make some parts of that fur a little bit darker, adding some darker bits like some shadow areas between the larger clumps of fur. Because it won't be like a group of lines, it won't be like a group of tiny hairs, it will be more like a group of a bunch of clusters or clumps of fur. And between those clumps of fur you will have those darker areas or shadow areas. And that's why occasionally we'll go back in and draw some of these darker or maybe slightly larger marks. And once you have all of that texture in place, you can blend a little bit more to soften that, because you want to avoid that looking like a bunch of ugly lines. And then as a final step in the process, I will go in with a pencil eraser, pulling some lighter marks, making that fur look three-dimensional. I will get to that in a few minutes, but as you can see right now I'm working with a brush. And brushes are essential when drawing fur, also when drawing hair, human hair, because the thing is that you can't really draw every single hair. And when you blend, you create that illusion of volume and density, and you soften the appearance of that fur or hair, making it look more voluminous and fluffier in this case. So essentially making it look more realistic. You can't really draw realistic looking fur without using brushes. I mean, you can, but they make the process so much easier and quicker. And there needs to be a little bit more shadow here on the other side of the head, on the other side of that horn. Like I said, it's important for me for that horn to stand out against the rest of the background. And now I'm working on the eye. These are some tiny details, as you can see in the reference, some tiny wrinkles around the eye. But I'm trying to draw them as best as I can. My charcoal pencil isn't that sharp, as you can see, but I can still include some of these smaller details. The thing is that I don't really need that much precision, because I'm not. It's not like I'm drawing a portrait of a person. So these tiny mistakes or tiny distortions, they won't really matter that much, because likeness is not really much of an issue here when I'm drawing wildlife. As long as it looks like the animal that I'm trying to draw, I think the viewers will be satisfied. Anyway, I did a bit more refining with a tortillon, and I drew the edge of the top part of the head. I'm going to be adding some more fur to that, but before I do any of that, I will first do a little bit more work on the fur here on the back and on the shoulder and the chest area, and I will do that with a pencil eraser. So once again, this is a soft rubber eraser in a pencil. It can be softened like a pencil, it can be held like a pencil, and it can be used to draw just like you would with a pencil, except with a regular pencil you make darker marks or black or grayish marks. Here with an eraser you make lighter marks because you're taking away value, and by doing that here, for example, I can draw these longer hairs of the fur around the ear and the neck area, making the head stand out against the rest of the body. I can also draw some lighter clumps of fur here at the top where the fur is longer and denser, and that will make that fur coat appear more three-dimensional, because whenever you're increasing that range of value between the lighter parts of the fur and the darker or shadow parts of the fur, you're creating an illusion of depth. You're making the fur look more three-dimensional, because when you look at those clumps of fur, you will see that some of them are sticking out more, while other parts are in the shadow because they're further away from the light source, or they're deeper in that fur coat. And those which are on the surface, they're obviously going to be catching more light and they're going to be lighter. So by manipulating the amount of value, you can create that illusion of layers and depth in the fur. And that's why it's important to have that range of value, and it's important to have that contrast in value between the lighter and darker areas in that fur. And that's why this process is done in several stages. First I lay down the texture, then I do a bit of blending, then I add maybe some shadow areas, then I do some work with an eraser, making some highlights or those lighter clumps of fur. Then I can always go back in and maybe add a few more shadow areas, a few more darker areas to add a little bit more depth to that fur. But you know, it doesn't really matter. Sometimes I will just go back and forth while I'm refining the fur. Here on the top of the head you can see that I already put down some much darker areas of fur, where I'm trying to create an impression like there are these shadow areas in between the larger clumps of fur. It doesn't look like much now. I'm going to add a little bit of vine charcoal on top of that, and it's going to look like maybe I'm ruining it, but once I start blending, the vine charcoal will be moved around more easily and it will get lighter. However, the areas that I put in, or that I drew in with a charcoal pencil using a little bit more pressure, those will remain darker. And now you can see that I'm creating something that actually looks like fur, and it's fairly dark fur, but some part of that fur are even darker. You can see that there are some shadow areas between those larger clumps of fur. So I'm going to be doing some more of that around on the head, and I'm adding a little bit more detail and texture on this horn here. It's going to remain of lighter value, but just a little bit of irregularities on the surface of that horn. And now, as you can see, around the eye and on the cheek area, maybe the fur gets a little bit shorter, and then around the mouth and under the jaw, in the neck area, the fur gets longer again. So I'm always paying attention to the length of the fur and the direction in which it grows or flows, and I'm trying to follow that with my pencils so that the fur would look realistic. So when you're trying furry animals, you need to pay attention to a couple of different things. First, you mustn't forget to keep in mind where the larger shadow areas are, because you can't get caught up in working only on the texture of the fur. So you need to remember that, for example, if you look at the legs, those parts of the legs which are facing away from the light source, those are some of the darkest bits in our drawing. So you need to pay attention to those larger shadow areas first. You put those in first, and then you play around with the texture of the fur. Anyway, I'm drawing a little bit of grass here at the bottom. So once again, this is a vignette. I'm not going to draw all of the grass. I'm not going to finish all of the scene. I'm not going to draw all the way to the edge of the paper. I'm just going to add a little bit of grass so that I add a bit of context to our main subject. So the scene takes place in a grassy area, and there's sky and clouds above the buffalo. I did a bit of work with a charcoal pencil first, then I'm doing a bit of softening with a brush, and then of course I'm gonna work with a pencil eraser. First I blended that nicely, and now I'm pulling some lighter strokes with a pencil eraser, and as you can see, some of those lighter marks will be going over the darker areas. I want them to overlap slightly so that it looks like actual grass, and some of those lighter areas will be going over the legs of the main subject so that it looks like the buffalo is standing in that grass, and that at least a part of its legs are obscured by that tall grass. I kind of made the grass sway a little bit more from left to right, and I did the same thing with the fur, because it looks to me like the wind is kind of blowing from left to right. So I'm going to try to maintain that direction, and here I'm just using my Tutilian to refine the appearance of the fur, especially the edges of the fur, so that it doesn't look like lines but rather like soft fur, clumps, lots of clumps of soft, longer fur. And I'm going to do a little bit more refining here on this longer fur around the neck area. I want to add some more shadow, because when you step back, you can assess whether some parts of the body of your main subject have enough shadow. So you mustn't forget about those larger relationships, as I already mentioned. So you step back, or you squint your eyes, you look, are the shadow areas in their place? Are they big enough? Are they dark enough? Because those larger relationships between the light source and the main subject are always very important. And I go back in and I put some more shadows where needed. And if I ruin the texture of the fur in some places while doing that, that's okay. I just do a little bit more blending, a little bit more work with an eraser, and I fix it. But I think that so far it's going pretty well. This, by the way, will be only one of the drawings in the series of wildlife drawings I'm about to do, because I'm about to do a series of commissioned drawings of animals. They will all be vignettes like this one. I've already done something similar with drawings of an elk, a bear, a cougar, and stuff like that, but these will be done on slightly larger paper. The paper here is 9 times 11 inches or 9 times 12 inches. So these, for me, these are medium-sized drawings. Here I decided to modify the shapes, the shape of the clouds a little bit. I didn't really like the shape that I initially created, so I want to modify the shape a little bit so that it matches, how would I explain this, so that it matches the position of the body of the main subject, so that it sort of amplifies the position or the shape of the body of the main subject, if that makes sense, and that it amplifies the movement of the grass and the fur from left to right. So I just thought that the composition would look a little bit better that way, so I added a little bit more clouds here on the right, and I took away a little bit above them, and I think the clouds look a little bit better now. I'm just refining some of the tiny details. Now this is a shorter version of the video. I'm going to put my signature here on the right side, by the way. This is this is a shorter version of this video. If you want to see the full-length narrated version, you should check out my Patreon, because on my Patreon you can see a lot more content, and you can see these full-length videos where you can observe the drawing process, what it looks like in real time. Anyway, I'm almost done here, just adding a little bit more shadow here on the legs before I wrap things up. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other videos. I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye.